So this session is called Smooth Sailing when Planning for the Casper Suite. Could be a few other alternative names, dodging bullets, other things like that. First of all, I'm just curious, how many of you are planning to implement the Casper Suite? Just by a show of hands. Good. Okay, right session. I saw lots of people here. Some of them might have been at the integrator session on Monday, and I was thinking, okay, this is just planning for Casper, so I'm not sure if you'll get much out of it, but yeah, those of you that are planning for this session is mostly about all the implementations that I've done and some of my colleagues have done, and just our experiences, things that we've learned, lessons learned, some of the mistakes that we've made ourselves, some of the mistakes we've seen people make, and just to share it so that you can avoid making the same. So as Jib said, my name's David Ackland, and I'm technical director for a company called AMSYS in the UK. We're a service provider, a very, very old, long-running service provider, and more recently, or since about 2012, we're a JAMF integration partner. And part of my job is going around and doing jump starts and other Casper implementations for lots and lots of companies. So the benefit of that is I get to see and repeat the installation over and over again, and I get to refine it over time. So the agenda, I've broken it down into 8 core areas. Sorry, it was 6 originally, and then I've expanded it. And crash. Okay. So planning first off, just things to think about before you actually start implementing. A bit about the initial setup and just a few things to avoid there. I have some opinions on packaging, and I'll share, and I have some opinions on imaging as well. A bit about policies, things to avoid, a bit about configuration profiles, scoping, and then just a few bits that don't really fit in any of those categories. As we're going through, and it's the same theme for all the other sessions, we'll do Q&A at the end. So just save your questions. For the benefit of the video and the audio, when you ask a question, I'll then repeat it just into the microphone, or Jib will repeat it. Try not to start having a big argument amongst yourselves, which we have seen a couple of times, because the video will just be me standing here like a lemon for 20 minutes waiting for you to finish. Cool, right. So, I've never actually really done this, but just putting it up there. I just want to kind of start off talking about mistakes that we make and the point of not hiding them and learning from them. There's an interesting book that I've been reading recently by a guy called Matthew Syed called Black Box Thinking, about airplanes and the black boxes and learning from mistakes and how you should actually make mistakes, share your experiences, learn from them, and not try and hide them. And obviously, in IT, you get different people behaving differently with their mistakes. Some of them might try and hide them, and it just causes more and more problems for people. So some of the mistakes that I'll be walking you through in this presentation, some of them I made, some of them my colleagues made, some our customers have made, and it's just to put it out there to say, we're not embarrassed by it, and let's just share the mistakes and learn from it and improve, and then we'll just continuously improve. So, just kicking off, planning first of all. So, this bit is quite important. I saw a JAMF Nation post. I go on JAMF Nation occasionally, and I saw a post where someone had bought the Casper Suite. I think they were the IT guy, and I think their manager had bought the Casper Suite. And he said, his JAMF Nation post was, can anyone tell me what I can do with Casper? And I thought, that's, a bit late. So work out what you want to do with it. Why are you buying Casper? Hopefully, you would have thought out what you want to do. Then you would have evaluated different products. Then you would have discovered that Casper's the right solution. And then you start implementing it. So work out what your goals are. Consider who they're going to be benefiting. And you've probably seen it before, where someone says, "I just want to lock everything down," and you think, well, is that of benefit to your users? Why do you want to lock it down? sometimes they don't think about the actual security part of it, and so they just want to just lock everything. And the last point, you don't have to use everything. Casper does so much stuff. You don't have to use all of it if you don't want to. It's that, some people think it's a return on investment kind of thing, where if I don't use every single button, I'm not getting value, but less is more. Okay, the other bits of planning, make sure you have everyone you need on board. That story I mentioned earlier about the IT guy saying, what can Casper do? He was clearly not involved in the initial discussion about let's get Casper. So you need the users, the networking. There's so many ports and other bits and pieces you need to get open. So you need the networking people, the server people, management. Just get everyone involved. Discuss the design and the prerequisites. So just make sure you're ready. Again, things like ports, making sure that you know what ports need to be open, in what direction, and so on. A couple of specific points. The JSS URL. So this is just my experience. You may do something different. So publicly resolvable. Ben Toms did a good session yesterday, I think, his session, yesterday, talking about certificates and public domain names. That doesn't mean publicly accessible, it just means publicly resolvable. So you may not want to make it publicly accessible, but if you make it publicly resolvable from the start, then you can choose to do that later on. We also tend to go with service, not server. I've seen a few people put in, setting up their JSS and calling the management URL jss01.local or something like that. Like you're going to have more JSSs, maybe, I don't know. I like something like Casper and then the rest of the domain name. The benefit of doing service and not the actual server fully qualified domain name, and it would be fine to make it just a C name down to the actual server, is if you want to replace that server with a different one, it's nice and easy to do. Changing the management URL is a right pain in the neck. It's one of those few things that just pick a name and just stay with it. Okay, also planning VPP and DEP, not much to say, but just sign up for them. And even if you're not going to use them straight away, just sign up for them, and then you've got them. They take a bit of time to get signed up for as well, so just do it from the start. Okay. The last point is just about some underlying technologies. When I first got involved with installing Casper, I expected it to be like this really easy double-click install and you're done. And then it said, go and install MySQL, create a database, and I thought, well, what's going on? Why is it so complicated? You need to understand a bit about MySQL, Java, and Tomcat. At least know that they're there and how to troubleshoot them. Because if one of these things stops working, then you're not in a happy place. Understand a bit about some of the limitations and scaling. It's amazing how soon you need to start upping the Tomcat memory. And you can't just add more RAM into the server. You have to change some of the Tomcat settings to use that RAM. Okay. Understand where obviously how to do backups. Before you actually go live with your service, try doing a backup and then try doing a restore so that you know the process. Because you don't, the first time you do that, you don't want that to be, when you've got 1,000 users on there. And the last point, I've done a few jump starts for people that they're Windows technicians, never seen a Mac before, and I think their managers assume that the jump start will make them a full Mac admin. 2 days, it's just not realistic. I'd say someone that's maybe a Windows technician that's never worked with Apple before, possibly 15 to 20 days training and a year's experience. That's probably about right, but not two-day jump start. You need to understand the technology a lot more. Things like preference files and configuration profiles and all of those kind of bits and pieces, you need to have a good understanding of that before you start using Casper. Cool. So, on the initial setup, first off, just get your backups all sorted out. Don't leave it till the end or say, oh, I'll do that later on because you'll get caught out. Store, so the two key things are your SQL database backups and your distribution point data. So obviously make sure they are backed up and make sure they're backed up on something else, not on the same drive on the server, which I've seen a few times. Push certificate. I've seen this a couple of times from consultants that go into a company and they set up the JSS and they create a push certificate with their own Apple ID and then they leave. And then it's all fine until 12 months later. And they go to renew and think, who made this certificate? If it's Mac OS 10 devices, it's not, you can get out of that hole just about. If it's iOS, you're really stuck. So keep the credentials safe. Just create a separate Apple ID for this particular purpose. And understand the renewal process. Know what you've got to do when you get to that point. Renewing is really, really easy as long as you've got the password to that Apple ID. And if you don't, you're in trouble. When it comes to system passwords, there's a couple of things we do. We make separate passwords for everything. So I've seen some organizations that will just, they'll have one password that they'll use across all their servers and even sometimes client devices for local admin accounts. So we just make separate passwords. It just makes it more secure. Don't use that. So in the guide, it says that. It doesn't mean actually use that password. So it would be great if it said, example, insert your password here. But there's been a few cases where that has been used. Test special characters. There's been a few odd issues people have had with the % sign, exclamation marks, other things where certain policies don't run or other weird things like that. So just make sure, be careful with those. Cool. Packaging. We've gone, if I looked at packaging the way we did it about 2 years ago to now, it's really changed. It's very, very different. So first of all, this concept of repackaging, just consider, do you actually need to do it? So I've seen lots of people that repackage the Office installer, and you think there's nothing wrong with the installer that just comes from the vendor. So just use that. If you want to, if you're in an education environment and you want to suppress the pop-up screens, use a config profile. You don't have to make a new package out of the Office installer with those settings bundled in. Just use auto-PKG, because it's great and it will help you. I'd still say understand the packaging process first, then use auto-PKG. Don't jump straight to it, because otherwise, if there's anything wrong with it or something's not working, you're not really going to understand what you're doing. So the other thing that we do is we use config profiles a lot. We found that where we used to kind of chuck plist files around, it kind of worked until we got to sort of 10.9, 10.10, and it got worse and worse and worse. And we started using config profiles a lot more, and it was just much nicer. Almost like that's what Apple want you to do. If we do need to bundle settings, and there's a few cases where the vendor puts their settings in just the wrong place, basically, package them up, but just package them separately. So don't touch the vendor package and make a separate package for the settings. The main benefit of that is that if there's a newer version of the vendor package, you can just replace it, but the settings are left intact. Right. Has anyone who's tried snapshot packaging? Put your hand up if you've tried this before. Yeah. It kind of works. There's this thing called kind of concept of monolithic packages. So there was the monolithic imaging process that we've all used for years, and we're all moving. Everyone says, don't do it. Do modular imaging. So instead, we have the OS, and then we just use this snapshot package that has everything inside it. We had a very recent case of a package that you deploy it, and it installs the piece of software. It also unjoins the machine from Active Directory and breaks a bunch of other things. And you think, well, we're installing an app, and then it breaks something else. And they used a snapshot package that had a copy of the system keychain in it, had saved application state folders, had the JAMF software plist file in it. They just clicked snapshot, and just grabbed everything and just bundled it in. And that will cause you all sorts of problems. This comes back to understanding Mac OS X and how to work with it, what the plists do. So if you do a snapshot and then you get your list of items, you need to really understand what each of those things are. Also, I use it as a last resort, so it's not the first. I've tried the vendor package first, try config profiles, and if everything else fails, then go to this. Yeah. And make sure you do strip out everything that you don't need in it, particularly the system keychain. Okay, fill user template, fill existing users. Again, use as a last resort. This has been a really, really good feature for a number of years. I kind of get the feeling that it's coming to the end of its lifespan, and config profiles and other things are going to be the way forward. When we look at the presentation Rich Troughton did on the first day about SIP, you can kind of see where it's heading. So probably, especially if you're planning on implementing Casper, try and avoid this as much as you can. Okay, a little bit about imaging. So first off, just laying down the OS. There's been a bunch of sessions about imaging over the past few days. So we do like to sort of take a look as, do we actually need to do it? It's not just the problem of laying down the OS. If you want to lay down an OS on a machine, you've also got to boot that machine from something other than its internal boot drive, which means you need something like NetBoot, and it just starts getting more and more complicated. And you should look and say, do I actually need to do this, or am I just wasting my time? And I had a customer before that was really struggling with it. They kind of didn't get the concept of Apple's newer OSs and newer hardware not booting from earlier versions, and the fact they had to update their NetBoot sets all the time. So we actually took a look at it and thought, well, you don't need to be doing this at all. So we just stripped it out. We chucked away NetBoot, chucked away the imaging process, and just went policy-based instead. If you do need to make an OS, I really recommend AutoDMG, or just making a very clean, slim OS. Don't try going back to the kind of monolithic image. If you are going to do imaging, and we tend to see this much more in schools that we work with rather than businesses, where NetBoot's very, very common. So NetBoot, obviously it's really useful. Done wrong, it will just cause you all sorts of problems. So, the Mac Minis, and you buy them, and they've got 5400 RPM hard drives. You're going to be able to NetBoot maybe 3 machines concurrently. It's going to be really painful. So make sure that the network link is fast enough, and make sure the drive that you're NetBooting from on the server is fast enough. Use IP helpers. It will just make your life a lot easier. If you need to NetBoot a client and the server is on a different VLAN or subnet, holding down N obviously won't work normally. Again, Rich Troughton's presentation was talking about trying to get SIP and getting the machines to NetBoot, and it was just a painful process to go through. If you use IP helpers, then it's just much, much easier. Network conditions, obviously, it's got to be gigabit, nothing less than that. We'd kind of recommend just using something like 10 gig Ethernet if you can. And that's where the NetSUS appliance, the virtual appliance, comes into play, because you can put that onto much faster hardware. And then test it, and make sure test it at scale. So don't just NetBoot one machine and go, good, works, move on. Because then as soon as you start NetBooting more machines, it's going to start falling apart. Okay. So a little bit about policies. So this is just a sort of a list of little bits and pieces, things to avoid. It's quite common to create smart groups, sometimes maybe extension attributes that drop the machines into the right group and then running the policies. Just make sure you do inventory updates if you're going to do that, because otherwise the policies will just keep running over and over again. So if you say, find machines that don't have Flash installed, then create a policy to run it, attach the update inventory afterwards, Otherwise, it's not going to know that Flash is installed, and it will just keep going over and over again. We kind of try to avoid this if we can. You can do it. You can kind of daisy chain loads of policies together and do one after another. It's fine until you then leave it for a while, and you come back a few months later and think, what is this doing? I don't understand. Just keep it nice and simple. Also, just be careful of the logs and the once per computer method. So smart groups are kind of the more recommended way of doing it. But you can just do a once per computer, and it uses the logs to know that it's run. So if you flush all the logs, it will try and rerun them. And just be careful using login and logout triggers. We don't really want to go into the Windows world where you go to log out and it says installing update, one of 382, and then you have to sit there for an hour waiting for it. I find that generally, I very rarely use the login and logout triggers because it annoys the user. So if you do use those triggers, just avoid anything big. So don't be installing software and other bits and pieces like that. So configuration profiles. This is kind of a bit about the underlying technologies. And first of all, the APNS process. Just make sure that you understand it and understand what the ports are and what direction the traffic is flowing. Especially because we're often like an external company going into organizations and saying, we need to do configuration profiles. We need to be able to explain it to the network person to say what we need them to do. And you need to have a good understanding of that. Monolithic, again, something I just generally dislike. Avoid monolithic profiles. And by monolithic profiles, I mean one configuration profile that has loads and loads of different settings in it. This comes down to the way that the profiles are deployed and when you make a change to them, how they want to redeploy to all your machines. So I've had a case in the past where someone was deploying, well, they made their monolithic profile. It was for iOS. It was for a load of corporate iPhones. And they put in the Wi-Fi settings and passcode policies, load of other things, and active sync settings. And then they went to make a change to it, and it removes the profile and then redeploys the new one, which removed their Exchange account and all their cached email, and then redeployed it. And half these users were all on data roaming plans, international company, traveling around the world. So obviously, they clicked the button, and that cost them quite a lot of money. So, and annoyed everyone, obviously. So. Yeah, so just understand the process of editing a profile and what it does, and the fact that it's going to redeploy to the devices. So this comes down to kind of testing, and this is sort of planning again. Before you start rolling it out, config profiles are definitely one of those things you want to kind of try out and get very comfortable with the process before you start unleashing it on your users. So one of the last categories is scoping. This is, again, another sort of just things to consider. Always start with one device. Those of you that have used Casper before, have you ever thought, I'll just go to all computers, because I know what this policy is going to do. What could go wrong? Eh? And then you just, about 5 seconds later, you just realize the depth of the mistake. I experienced this at an organization, and we were doing energy saver config profiles. And we'd used this with things like Workgroup Manager and MCX for years, where we just set the schedule so the machine shut down at, I think it was like 9 o'clock at night, and then power back on at 7 o'clock in the morning. So there's a config profile for that now. So we just made the setting, and I thought, I've done this so many times, I know what's going to happen. So scope to all. Click go. This was an office with maybe 300 users. Everyone got a message saying your computer is going to restart in 5 minutes that they couldn't get rid of. Then all the machines started restarting. Then they started up, they go to log in, and it just goes to a white screen. You unplug the network connection, you log in, white screen. You log in as the local admin user, white screen. Every machine was dead. So that wasn't a happy day. It turned out that there was a bug with that particular version of the JSS that caused this problem. It corrupted a preference file in the hard drive. As soon as we narrowed that down and deleted the file, rebooted the machines, they were fine. But if I'd stuck to my rule of always scope to one device first, I would have been fine. So it's because I, over-arrogant, thought, I know how to do this, and then caused a problem. Luckily, they're a really nice customer, so they, and it was Friday afternoon, so I think half of them just went home. They're like, oh, cool, we're done. Okay, so always start with one device. Scoping based on extension attributes. This is just kind of be careful, I suppose, because you need to really understand the extension attributes and how it works and what that's going to do, especially sort of script-populated extension attributes. Just test them very, very carefully. I tend to not use exclusions if I can help it. I'm the same with when it comes to sort of file server permissions. I don't like that, allowing everyone and then setting lots of deny rules and stopping people from doing things. It makes it very, very complicated and hard to understand. Even if it seems like a good idea at the time, come back to a few months later and you're going to really struggle to understand even what you did. Just a random one here, AD bind status. It doesn't really work, so avoid that one. It just says, that it's joined to the domain. It says the machine, in theory, should be joined to the domain. And that's about as accurate as it's going to get. So it can't really be relied on. If you really want to detect the AD bind status, then you're going to have to either go on JAMF Nation or find some of the scripts that have been knocking around, or build your own to really detect. Okay. Also, just consider the network speeds of the clients and where they're going to be. Particularly when you get iPhones and other users traveling around the world, then you can cause some issues there if you start deploying larger things to them. We quite often use the network segments in this case, so that we know if the machine is on the LAN or what LAN, if it's an international company, which LAN are they on, to make sure that they goes to the right distribution point, and you don't get someone that's on a 3G connection, VPN'd in, and then things start happening on their computer. So just a few last points. And so these are the things that didn't really fit in any kind of particular category. So this is one of our sort of, I suppose, underlying philosophies when we're kind of working with Macs and Apple and Casper and lots of different technologies. Try and understand, it kind of sounds like I'm preaching, but try and understand the way that particular company works and just go along with it. When you look at that presentation that IBM did, their deployment method was very Apple-like, which is why it was so smooth. If you do it a different way and try and say, well, we're going to use, there's loads of technologies that just, they've never really worked very well with OS X or iOS. And if you just keep fighting against it, you're just causing yourself more and more grief. There's lots of people saying, don't join the end devices to Active Directory anymore, which is kind of interesting. And we agree with that. Very difficult to convince customers to do it, but if you join the machines to Active Directory, just expect more issues. Thank you. Hey. Document everything. Very, very important. Even for yourself, if you're at a company and you're implementing Casper, just write everything down. It doesn't have to be pretty, but just write down all the passwords, the IP addresses, everything, because you might be coming back to it 6 months later, and you'll need your own documentation, because you can't just remember everything. So we're obviously very big on this. Because we're an external company, again, we have to document everything, because going to hand this over to the customer at some point. And we can't just say, right, we've installed your JSS, bye, and then that's it. We've got to give them all of the details. Cool. Right. And that's my last point. So thank you very much. Quicker than I thought, but that's good. So. Right, so just open it up to any questions that you've got. Hey.
A bit of a question, just one more thing, one more suggestion. I see this all the time. Naming conventions. When you're naming policies, smart groups, develop a consistent naming policy.
Sure.
A lot of times I have smart groups, I'll suggest needs latest Flash player. Policy to update will be update Flash player. So it's brilliantly obvious to anybody working on it.
Yeah.
So you have different teams of people that are working on it.
Absolutely. So the point was about more of a recommendation and just having a good naming convention, probably for everything really, policies, config profiles, the packages, pretty important. It does depend slightly whether you work on your own or whether you work as part of a team, but try and do something that's just very intuitive and people will easily understand. Any other questions? Sorry, over there.
One of my recommendations, not a question, based on my personal experience as well, and it's dovetailing on your don't go against the grain, is if you're working in an environment that segments your IT department out, where you have like an InfoSec team, a networking team, infrastructure team, find out what those teams' SLAs are ahead of time as part of your project planning, because if you expect to have a turnaround in 24 hours and they give you a 2-week lead time, you could shoot yourself in the foot and make some upper-level management very disappointed.
Yeah. So this was this point was talking about when you have a larger team and maybe separate networking department and maybe security department. One of the other points was about making sure everybody's involved, but the key point made here was understand what their SLAs are and how quickly can they get things done for you. This is a particular pain point for me when I do jump starts, because there's prerequisites, and then we have a call ahead of time to make sure the prerequisites are understood. And I have turned up before, and I've said, right, so where are we installing the JSS? And they've forgotten to get a server. Or the most common one is the network ports. They forget all of them. And then they go to the network guy and say, we need these ports open, and we need them now. Drop everything, which isn't really fair. So, cool. Any other questions? There's one over there. Yeah.
If you're in an environment where you have to push out software via policy, where it doesn't go through a self-service, is there any particular good tips that you have for setting those policies up, or like making sure that software gets out there completely and correctly?
Yeah. So the question was just about deploying software via policies, not self-service, but by automated policies. Yeah. And just tips on how to try and make sure it works properly and smoothly. The main things I'd say would be understand where the client devices are, so network segments, and make sure you're deploying to devices that can reach the distribution points and have a good enough speed link. The mistake I've seen a couple of times is where they create a network segment and they forget that VPN users are then considered on the LAN, and then it starts trying to install Adobe Creative Cloud or something like that over a VPN connection. So that's definitely one thing. If it's education, then we might use a startup policy or maybe even log in or log out. If it's business, we'd typically always use the recurring check-in trigger, because the user's laptop user, and they never log in, log out, restart. The only one that really kicks in is the recurring check-in. Any other questions?
Yeah. That a little bit. Depending on the size of the organization, a lot of times, obviously, you want to test that update yourself.
Yeah.
A machine that is not one that you're manually updating, and make sure, did this actually install a package? Is the package, did I screw up with the scoping, and is the policy
Yeah.
done repeatedly? For large organizations, I will often identify a group of test users, and they will
Sure.
get that update first. And there's usually about a period of time, about a week or so, where I'll let them get the update before deploying it out to everyone, unless it's a critical zero-day security update.
Absolutely. So this is just additional recommendation to make sure the policies run smoothly, and mostly just coming down to testing, really. So scope to one device, make sure it actually deploys properly and works. And we use the same method. We have we tend to have like a static group, and we pick the worst users in the organization, the ones that really don't, that they're always complaining, and so we always pick those. Don't pick the nice guys, because they'll just say, yeah, it's fine. And they probably hadn't even launched the app. They're like, yeah, probably okay. And then you'll deploy to everyone and then find out there is actually an issue. When you're deploying the software, make sure you deploy to the users that actually use the software, not just a bunch of random people. So yeah, that's pretty important. And make sure they have actually used it and have found out any bugs. Because when you start getting into the really big numbers, if you start deploying things to thousands of devices, you can't really undo that. Casper has actually got an uninstall feature for packages. We never use it. It just makes more of a mess. With OS 10, we always kind of assume that when we install something, it's kind of a one-way process, and it's very, very difficult to undo that. So hence the scope to one, then a small test group. Any other questions? Hey.
So I'm kind of new to the Mac environment, and you mentioned kind of understanding how profiles work, keyless files work, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Where would you recommend I go to learn more about this?
Apple's training has kind of slimmed down quite a bit now. There is still just the Support Essentials training course, Apple's Support Essentials course, and that's a really good one to do. Nice and short, and just it covers things like plist, a bit of an introduction to the terminal. You've also got the CCT course that's kind of from JAMF, and it's half Casper, but also lots of OS 10 Support Essentials type stuff. So one of those two routes would definitely be a way to go. The difficulty is trying to use Casper, not understanding how OS 10 works, is just going to be really, really difficult. So, you can say so.
If you want to learn about config profiles in general, using them for settings management,
Yep.
William Smith did a presentation at Penn State Mac and Mins in 2014. It's up on YouTube. And
Okay.
It's about using config profiles for preference management.
Great.
That's a great one. And then the managing Apple devices.
Yeah. So you get that. So the recommendation was William Smith's presentation at 2014 Penn State about config profiles and using them to manage settings. If you are going to learn, I've been preaching a bit, but I've always had this kind of rule of only learn new things and don't try and learn the old technologies. If you're new to the Mac or iOS or Casper, you may feel initially slightly intimidated by all these people that say, oh, I've been working with Macs for 15 years, 20 years, and you think, oh, they've got all this knowledge. Just learn the new, there's so much new stuff to learn. If you try and learn all the historical stuff just to keep up with people, and it's not going to benefit, it'd be like learning managed preferences when we don't use managed preferences anymore. Just focus on the new stuff. Config profiles are a really important one, though. And the more you can use them, the easier your life is generally. Any other questions? Hey.
You mentioned not finding computers to be Active Directory. Do you have a quick sort of pros and cons for that?
Yeah, there's mostly cons. There is scenarios where we do it. So the question was joining machines to Active Directory, pros and cons as to why you would do it. This could turn into a massive discussion, but so we'll keep it kind of short and focused. So there's lots of scenarios where we do use it. It tends to be schools and labs of shared devices. So you go into a classroom and there's 30 iMacs, and you've got 5,000 students, Active Directory. Using local accounts is going to be very, very difficult. One-to-one deployments, that's the area where you think, do we need to use Active Directory? The main issues we get, stability is a big one. Just the stability of logging in. Logging into a local account is so much more stable than logging into a network account, just in its nature. Also, just problems with OS 10. So internally at AMSYS, when Yosemite came out, half the company upgraded pretty much that day, as soon as it came out, and no issues. Everything was brilliant because we don't log into directory accounts. We then got a customer that was deploying a new classroom of machines. Has anyone experienced that Yosemite Active Directory crash halfway through startup thing? Yeah, so we've quickly found out that 10.10, 0, 1, and 2, the machines will randomly crash halfway through starting up if they're joined to Active Directory. So if you don't join the machines to Active Directory, you just avoid that whole problem. So the other thing is, on one-to-one deployments with Active Directory, you've got to ask yourself, why are you doing it? You know, what's the user actually getting? So many people now are using cloud-based services. So the idea of getting a Kerberos ticket might not really be that beneficial. Cool. Right, any other questions? I don't know. Mm-hmm.
And we're finding a hard time using triggers for that. We've tried to log in and log out. It doesn't really work because the login and the login is free non-login with encryption of the machine, which means the user has to log out first.
Mm-hmm.
The login, finish the login, log out, and then log in again for that policy to trigger.
Right, okay.
Enable the management account. Do you recommend any other ways to trigger that second policy to enable the management account?
It's a tough one. So the question is about file vault, and so we're talking about enabling it for the management account.
Yeah, the initial user is fine. Yeah. Once they're in, they can enable it and then they can log in. But we also have the management account machine. So if you only enable the file vault encryption for that user, once you restart the machine, there's no way for you to log in as a help desk or whatever management
Sure.
you use. It doesn't even come up, only the main user.
Yeah. So strangely enough, we're kind of slightly newer on the file vault side. We don't get as many requests. You think everyone would just use file vault all the time. We don't get that many requests to do it. When we do, we tend to use command line, FDE setup, generally, because you just got a lot more control over it, and you can just get it to do whatever you want. But still, you can use a policy, go to the files and processes section, and you can add in the commands there that you might want to use. And that'd be a nice, just clean, easy way of doing it.
You use FDE setup with actual file that has the path, the local administrators using the path.
Sure.
You obviously want to remove that file, SRM it, and you're done.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Rich Trouton's blog is probably your best source for.
Yes.
I actually don't think that too, so.
Yeah. Yeah. So pretty much anything file vault, Rich Trouton's nicely nominated himself as the go-to person for that. So cool. Any other questions? Just right in the middle.
You mentioned not going against the grain. What are some examples of technologies or workflow that you commonly see that go against the grain that should be avoided?
So the question is, going against the grain, what's kind of some of the main things that I've seen that are causing problems? One is not using config profiles. Trying to just create a package that deploys a preference file, you'll find it's unstable, doesn't really work very well. And if you're trying to use that to deploy a setting, if you switch to config profiles, which is kind of the way that Apple want you to go, it's all fine. Some of the other big ones we always fight against. Authenticated proxies are just a pain. There's not usually much we can do about it. We've got to just live with it and make it work. Trying to think what else. Has anyone else got any examples of things that they've really fought against?
Windows antivirus with on-access scanning enabled, which kills performance.
Right, yeah. So antivirus and on-access scanning. One of the things there's a real theme of companies that have lots and lots of Windows computers, then they buy Macs, and they say, right, we're just going to manage them exactly the same way that we do PCs. That is going against the grain and will cause you all sorts of problems. You've got to look at the Macs as different computers to Windows and managing them differently and taking a completely different approach, and your life will just be much, much nicer. Cool. Any other questions? Cool. I think that's everything. I think we're done.
Thank you very much, everyone.